Hi everyone, welcome back. This week we're going to talk about some of the nuts and bolts of research methods within a research proposal. And we've talked briefly already about qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods approaches. And your book covers each of those types of research throughout the different chapters. But now we're really focused on how those methods differ and what you're going to want to consider as you start to develop a research plan within those methodologies. I'm also going to provide some examples of qualitative and quantitative studies to give you a better idea of what those would actually look like in practice. So qualitative and quantitative methods differ in several important characteristics and in their strategies of inquiry. Qualitative research is generally in the natural setting of the subject of the research, and the researcher is actually the key instrument. That is, the observations of the researcher with all of their prior experiences, their knowledge that go into the research. There's also use of multiple sources of data, such as interviews, observation, focus groups, and they may be all used in the same study. The analysis is inductive and interpretive without the requirement for statistical inference. For those of you who don't like statistical methods, that may seem like a blessing. For those of you who are more statistical oriented, that may seem like a weakness. A theoretical lens or philosophical viewpoint is very much part of the design, with the expectation that the participants' views and the meanings that they attach to the things around them are the core interest of the study. There are a number of data collection methods, frequently called strategies of inquiry, in qualitative work. Remember, the qualitative work is open-ended and focused on the participants themselves. In the narrative approach, the researcher asks open-ended questions and allows individuals to tell their stories of their lives, which are often retold by the researcher as a narrative chronology. In phenomenology work, the researcher delves deeply into a specifically identified phenomenon as described by the research participants. When the researcher studies an intact cultural group within their natural setting, this is called ethnography. This approach is historically associated with anthropology. Clifford Geertz is often credited with establishing ethnography, but there's also plenty of other examples, Margaret Mead and others who pioneered the area of ethnography. It's also used in sociology and less extent in health sciences, but you will see it in things like medical sociology and also more and more within public health research. If one individual or event is the focus of a study, we call that a case study. We've also previously touched on grounded theory, and in this strategy, the researcher develops a general abstract theory of some human interaction, event, or process, grounded on the views and orientation of the research participants. Once the strategy of inquiry has been decided on, the actual method of data collection is chosen, and there are 4 basic methods in public health research: observation, interview, documents, or audiovisual approaches. Observation is relatively self-explanatory. The researcher observes a given group, individual, event, or phenomenon, making note of the actions and reactions of the participants. The researcher may use interviews to elicit information from the participants, asking open-ended questions to get as complete a response as possible. Another approach is to use documents that can be abstracted to gather information. These may be community documents, first-hand accounts of an event or phenomenon, or other forms of documents. Finally, participants can be recorded and their actions, reactions, or thoughts reviewed. Each of these methods can be used with any of the strategies of inquiry, and the decision on which to use depends on the research question asked and on available participants, access to the natural setting of the participants, funding, and other factors. It's really important as we think about doing these kinds of study design that we get the consent of participants, not just to those who are aware of the research being conducted, but anyone who may be participating in the study. I had my own personal experience with this as an undergrad sociology student, where I thought I had obtained sufficient consent from different participants in a community group. And during a larger than expected community meeting, I was recording the session mostly to make it easier to take notes, but I also had permission from the hosts of the event to record it. But during the session, there was somebody that was concerned that I was a reporter. I was in Chicago at the time, and they called me out in this meeting and wondered why I was there and was very suspicious of me. And I explained why I was there and that I was conducting research. That didn't actually help my situation much. There was a lot of skepticism about research in that community. And so maybe that's why I'm a quantitative researcher now. But in any case, especially when you're doing anything audio, visual, and recording, that can elicit a lot of fear, it can elicit a lot of misunderstandings. So be sure to get consent from everyone who's participating in a study like that. Again, in qualitative methods, the researcher is a major component of the research design, often functioning as the data collecting instrument. Because of this, it is common for the researcher and participant to have extensive contact with participants. This can lead to issues in the course of research, particularly if the contact is sustained. We saw an example of this of an interview with a gentleman who suffered from a mental health disorder and was homeless. And we saw how the relationship broke down when there was stresses in the environment. Personalities can clash, opinions can differ, frustrations arise, just like in life. In qualitative work, the researcher should include a discussion on his or her experience with the participants and/or the phenomenon under study, including how he or she will gain entry into the natural setting of the participant. Ethical issues must be addressed in all of these settings, but can be of particular importance in qualitative work in terms of interactions with the participant. Just your presence alone can introduce ethical issues. Observational and interview methods should have written protocols for how they will be done. Using any of the observational method techniques, it's important to know what will be the type of observations. Are they going to be purely descriptive? Are they going to be reflective? As well as any demographic information that'll be collected. And when interviewing, the questions to be asked should be known and space provided for the taking of notes. There should be an icebreaker, something to help put the interviewee at ease, several general questions, some probing questions, and concluding questions. An interview structure or protocol can leave room for the participant to provide additional information beyond the structured questions, but a general protocol should exist. Again, by their very nature, being open-ended questions, you want to leave room for the participant to share their views, but you want to have enough structure that you can tell participants in advance what to expect in terms of questions. Likewise, in terms of gaining ethical review board approval, it's important to have structured your questions so that it's clear what types of answers might be elicited during your interviews. All research requires interpretation. In the case of qualitative methods, text and image data is interpreted either looking for general themes or in procedures that are spelled out within the specific strategy of inquiry. In qualitative research, the idea is to achieve a deep understanding of the phenomenon, event, or population under study, looking at themes and determining the greater meaning of the data. The anthropologist Clifford Geertz used the term thick description, which I like to think of when I'm doing ethnographic work or doing other qualitative methods. From that thick description, you sometimes get more data and more detail about what's going on than if you were to take a more superficial view using simply general instruments or surveys to collect your data. In your textbook, you'll see a graphic representation of the method of data analysis in qualitative research. Once the raw data is collected, it must first be organized, and all of the data is read through and coded into themes and descriptive categories. These are then interrelated, and the meaning of the themes and/or descriptions are interpreted to provide an outcome of the research. The interpretation may lead to the development of a new theory, new programs for prevention of health issues, educational methods, or other public health protocols. Note also that validation must occur to confirm the accuracy of the information used to form these interpretations. Regardless of the research approach, all research must use validated tools for our conclusions to be valid. Researchers conducting qualitative studies can validate their data by checking the accuracy of their findings in a number of ways. The researcher can triangulate using multiple sources to confirm the same item of information. A thorough description can help validate information, as can prolonged time in the field, leading to greater knowledge and understanding of the subject of the research. Clarifying one's biases, peer review, and external auditing are also tools available for validation. Reliability is achieved by using a consistent approach across projects and settings, making work more readily reproducible. Generalizability is the ability to apply findings to the general population, which is really the staple of quantitative research. It is not often possible in qualitative research because the focus in the research is on the particular group, whether it be one group or several groups or some event or some phenomenon. There really is no intent to generalize beyond the particular group of participants under study, even if there may be a temptation to think about how this might apply to other settings or other groups. In general, the discussion in the write-up for qualitative research should match the strategy of inquiry. That is, the results of a study that uses a narrative strategy should be discussed from that standpoint. Quotations and parts of conversations can be used to emphasize themes that are identified. Metaphors, analogies can describe theories developed. The first person voice form should be used in discussion of qualitative research. And as with all research, the findings should be related back to an existing theory and to the literature available on the subject. So now we're going to look at an example of a qualitative study. We'll look at the components of the study. We'll look at some of the details from each of the sections of the article, but not all of them. You're encouraged to find additional examples of these pieces of research as provided by the published journal article shown here. Specifically, the study sought to understand the psychosocial and personal factors that influence the disproportionately low evacuation response of African Americans in New Orleans in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. So here it is very clearly spelled out what the factors are and what is of interest, and also the population of interest in this study. The authors provide even more detail on the specific nature of their sampling strategy and the sample size and the way they obtain their sample. So in this case, we have a sample of 53 African Americans that were recruited, and we're also told that they were recruited by convenience sampling. In convenience sampling, participants are those who are conveniently located or available for the study, rather than randomly sampled. This approach is often used within subpopulations that may be otherwise hard to access. There may be ways in which friends can be recruited more easily than people who are outside that social network. More recently, there's a strategy called snowball sampling, which takes advantage of these social networks to increase recruitment. If you recall, theory is an important part of qualitative research. And here the authors tell us that the health belief model forms the framework for the study and the basic assumptions that go into this model. This is a well-established model used in health and public health qualitative research. The first component of the methods section of this article shares with us how participants are recruited and clearly states that the American Red Cross facilitated recruitment by providing lists of those who were evacuated from New Orleans to Columbia, South Carolina, and that they were lodged in hotels, and the specific dates in which observations were taken. The authors clearly state the consent was obtained and who conducted the focus groups. In this case, it was African American women, and why these facilitators were chosen. Additionally, a previously validated focus group protocol was used, including the need for all participants to maintain confidentiality, rules for appropriate group behavior, and introductions. In the methods section of the article, it is clearly spelled out how the focus group data was handled, transcribed verbatim. The authors developed a list of probable themes from the literature review, and this was used to help classify participant responses. Additional reading shows that this codebook was expanded as additional themes were developed from the focus group results. This is a typical approach to start with a loose codebook or an idea of what will likely be captured, and then to expand that as the research continues. The authors are careful to note that validation was done in the form of the team reviewing the code structure twice and 2 team members separately coding all of the transcripts to determine the level of similarity between the two. This is overall a good approach for validating data, especially that's qualitative in nature. If you can't come to an agreement among 2 reviewers, often you'll have a 3rd member of your research team who can arbitrate between those 2 and come to some sort of agreement on the best way to capture that response. In presenting the results, the first results noted here are describing the participants, just like you would in any quantitative study. It mentions that there were 53 African Americans who took part in the focus group. 67% were male, 73% were single, and the mean age of the participants was almost 50 years of age. Later, the results based on the health belief model were given based on the 4 determinants listed. In the discussion section, the authors relate the results back to the health belief model. In this paragraph, the perceived susceptibility category is discussed with regards to the hurricane and its presentation to the public. As in all write-ups for research, you must describe the limitations of the study. In this example, they make the point that the experiences of their participants may not be generalizable to the entire African American community, or even those who did not evacuate before the hurricane made landfall. They provide ways in which the participants may differ from the community at large. Okay, let's switch gears a bit and look at quantitative methods. After doing the literature review, each quantitative study needs a research plan. This consists of the design, a description of the population or sample of subjects used, any instrumentation used, measurements, the variables measured, and the plan for data analysis. We're going to now look at each of these in more detail. The primary quantitative research designs include descriptive studies, cross-sectional studies, case control studies, cohort studies, and experimental designs. This will have been introduced to you in courses in epidemiology and biostatistics, and they are kind of the workhorses of public health. There are lots of variations on these standard study designs, but often studies can be categorized into one of these buckets. Descriptive designs are done to describe some sample or population in terms of certain variables, often demographic and those associated with health behaviors. Cross-sectional studies provide a snapshot in time within a specified sample or population. Case control and cohort studies are generally used to determine the risk factors for health outcomes by comparing those with and those without the outcome, or those who develop and those who do not develop the outcome based on exposure status. In experiments, the researcher manipulates one or more variables in a defined sample to determine how that manipulation impacts the health outcome of interest. The study population and the sample used in the study must be clearly stated, listing the characteristics of the group and how the sample was taken. Ideally, sampling is done randomly or some sort of stratified random sampling. If this is completely impractical, some variant on convenience sampling or snowball sampling or other methodology may be appropriate. In quantitative research, the power of a study to discern significant results is an important consideration in determining sample size. This power requires, first of all, adequate sample size, and there are multiple sample size calculators available to determining both power and sample size. Usually when we calculate sample size, we must also have some expectation as to what effect size we're looking for. The instruments used in quantitative research may include surveys, data abstraction forms, or other data collection instruments. Surveys are frequently used to gather information directly from subjects, while abstraction forms are used to gather information from a variety of sources, including medical records or registries. Regardless of what type of instrument is used, how it was developed should be described, and it should be pilot tested prior to use. Pilot testing allows a researcher to make changes to the instruments that may be necessary for the specific sample being used. A survey may need adjustments to increase the likelihood it will be completed, especially for surveys that are perhaps too long or aren't readily understood by participants. This is a reason to pilot test a survey, possibly using smaller sections first to handle the issue of interpretability, and then also to give different lengths of survey to understand the effects of length on user fatigue. The items in a survey and any scoring method that will be used should be described in detail, as well as validation from previous research included in its description. Often we want to use previously existing measurement scales as they've been validated and the reliability of those instruments is known. It's really important that the variables to be measured or gathered are described in quantitative research. They are frequently grouped into things like demographic factors, risk factors, and most importantly, we should have some outcome measure. We may also want to have some secondary outcome measure or some way of assuring that we measure our outcome measure, because obviously without that, we don't have a study. These are often listed in a table that includes any categories for nominal or ordinal variables and the units for scale variables. Every quantitative research study should be very specific in its analysis plan as to which methods will be used to analyze different variables. This can include descriptive statistics and inferential statistics, and the specific bivariate or multivariate methods that are going to be used. You also want to state what level of significance will be used in your study. You'll also want to make some mention of how you determine the necessary sample size to have sufficient power to find differences that you might be interested in. You should also list any potential confounding variables and any effect modifiers you identify in advance. As you will learn in a course in statistics, often our statistical method is based on the level of measurement of the dependent and the independent variable, and whether they're nominal, ordinal, or interval level scales. You can find other similar tables in other textbooks, but it's conceptually important to think about what is the test that we're going to use. So for example, we'll often list bivariate approaches, including chi-square tests, t-tests, analysis of variance, and for adjusted analysis, are we going to use some sort of regression technique, such as multiple linear regression or logistic regression. Experimental designs are considered the gold standard of evidence. And though they are the gold standard, they are also often the most expensive and difficult to conduct. Experiments are a special form of quantitative research in which the researcher manipulates one or more variables. The best known experiments are clinical trials in which one group is given a particular medication, procedure, instruction, or other practice, while a comparison group is given placebo, current treatment or practice, or no instruction or nothing at all. The same components of research design are required for experiments as other forms of quantitative research, but they often require more human protection or institutional review board oversight. This includes a data monitoring board to look at adverse events and certain decision rules that will be used to stop research if there are an excess number of adverse events and other considerations. Note that all research involving human subjects does require clearance by an IRB, even if it is to request an exemption. Regardless of study design, we need to think about threats to validity. This includes both internal and external validity, statistical validity, and construct validity. Internal validity involves the ability to draw conclusions about the association of the variables measured in the study. External validity refers to the ability to generalize our conclusions of a study to the population of interest. Statistical validity requires choosing appropriate statistical tests for the type and number of variables used. Finally, construct validity has to do with how well our measures can measure some construct. This can be especially difficult when the construct itself is complex. Secondary analysis is often used in quantitative studies where an existing data set that was gathered previously is used for another study. Often we do this with larger studies that were purposely created to allow for multiple investigators to answer research questions. Many students who do research will start using secondary data because it can be very costly and time-consuming to collect data of your own. However, secondary analysis can be used to test new hypotheses or to examine relationships between variables not previously described. There is a tendency for these data sets to be very well picked over, so it's important that you consider whether or not the research question has already been addressed by other researchers. Overall, however, secondary analysis are very efficient and cost-effective because the time-consuming and expensive data gathering steps have already been done. The caveat to secondary data analysis is that the variables you specifically want to answer your research questions may or may not be contained in the database to which you have access. This is why it's very important before digging too deeply into a research study using secondary data that you make sure that you have the variables you need to answer your specific research question. When developing a research plan involving secondary data, you should include all of the same components that would be included in other quantitative studies, but also a description of how you will gather the data, how the data was originally collected, and how others could gain access to the data. Besides databases that have been generated by specific large studies, there are other sources of previously gathered data. The CDC has an online search system for public health data that is publicly available. Also, data from NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which is conducted annually, is also available. Harvard University maintains the MCH Data Connect, a collection of maternal and child health databases. The University of Michigan has a very large centralized system for storing databases. Other databases exist that collect health and public health data. So just like we did with a qualitative study, let's look at an example of a quantitative study. In this case, it's a prospective study or cohort study that was done to look at the variables associated with depression following military deployment. The authors introduced the study, explaining they used data gathered as part of the Millennium Cohort Study to see how depression and deployment are related. The Millennium Cohort Study was originally started with a randomly selected sample of military personnel and expanded to include more service personnel. In the methods section, the study subjects are described as the first randomly sampled military personnel who made up the Millennium Cohort Study, and for whom complete data was available. It is not uncommon for data to be missing for some variables. There is additional specification of what demographic data will be used. The decision about which of these variables to include is based on what the researchers feel might be associated with depression or that should be controlled for in the course of the research. The statistical analysis plan is described including the descriptive statistics for deployment status, demographics, and other factors. The authors state that they used multivariate logistic regression models and their plan to adjust for various control variables. From this section in the results, we see that it clearly states that the deployed and non-deployed subjects were compared, and those who were deployed were more likely to be younger and on active duty. A table is referenced, the first table often representing the descriptive statistics that describe the sample. The authors also found that those with combat exposures were more likely to have new onset depression, providing the percent of each group, and again referencing the table in which this information can be found. In the discussion section, the authors relate their work to previous research, indicating that previous work found similar risks, but then describe where their work differs from the others. The authors also relate their findings back to the hypothesis, in this case, that stress associated with combat may lead to depression. They also provide a suggestion, mitigation by selective deployment to decrease the risk of depression. Providing potential solutions to the research problem is one function of research. We're going to turn now briefly to talk about survey development and how to collect quantitative data using surveys. Surveys are very commonly used in quantitative research. Sometimes the survey chosen is a previously developed one and often previously validated, and the reliability is known. That is, it has been developed for and used in previous research. Sometimes, however, it's necessary to create an entirely new survey that's specific to our own research goals. There are many tools to help develop surveys. Surveys can be given on paper or online. There are many tools out there to develop and deploy surveys. Surveys can be given on paper, but more and more online. And Microsoft and a number of other software companies have made software to help with writing surveys and for delivery. SurveyMonkey is one of the best known online survey development tools and is relatively inexpensive. There are many others out there. Qualtrics has become both the standard and also very expensive. I love Qualtrics, but it's also getting very expensive. But there are a lot of tools out there for conducting surveys. Surveys should always have an introduction explaining the purpose of the surveys. Most surveys include demographic questions and questions specific to the area under study. It's important to explain why the demographic questions are necessary, as well as any specific content-related questions. A closing comment, frequently thanking the respondent for his or her time and help, should be included at the end of the survey. When designing surveys, you should only ask the questions that are absolutely necessary to ask and to get the information you need to test your hypothesis. Each item in the survey should be justified. Generally, the length of time it takes to complete a survey will have more influence on people completing it than the number of pages on the survey. Limiting the time it takes to complete the survey often involves making the questions as efficient as possible. But be careful that if you're using a validated or reliable scale, by omitting items from that scale, you decrease its validity and you also could decrease its reliability. Formatting is also important in making surveys easy to complete and encourage completion by respondents. Be sure to use appropriate language for the target group for the survey. For example, the level of language used will be different for academic respondents than for high school students. Similarly, cultural appropriateness can go a long way to encouraging completion of surveys by the respondent. When writing the survey, you should avoid biased questions. This may seem obvious, but you don't want to lead your respondents to providing specific answers, especially ones that might be considered socially favorable. There are also questions that may be objectionable, and these should be avoided whenever possible, ones that might potentially offend the respondent or evoke emotions that may be uncomfortable. Questions should be specific and individual. That is, questions that have two components, such as how often do you read to your child and help them with homework, should actually be separated into individual questions. These will help you to gather more specific information and reduce any confusion on the part of the participant. These may seem like common sense, but it's really important that you keep these things in mind as you're creating a survey, especially as the time and length of your survey is key in getting responses. Well, thank you for your attention during this week's lecture. I hope it's been helpful for thinking about some concrete examples of research. And as always, I encourage you to reach out if you have any questions about specific approaches that relate to your research topics that might be helpful. That's all for now. Have a great week. Thanks. Bye.